The Podium Pod is brought to you by The Pick and Roll. Head to pickandroll.com.au and subscribe for in-depth commentary and analysis on Aussie hoops. We're also brought to you by FBL, Fantasy Ballers League, an Australian baller lifestyle brand that aims to provide you with classics on and off the court. FBL makes a bold statement in its distinctive white, black and gold colours, with products ranging from basketball shoes to apparel, accessories and more. Be bold with gold. Check out the FBL collection at fblsport.com today. And don't miss the 2023 FIBA World Cup, with all 82 games brought to you live and exclusively across ESPN, ESPN2 and the ESPN app. Plus, all Boomers games, Team USA games and finals will be available on ESPN via KO freebies at no charge. Hello everyone and welcome to the Podium Pod, the podcast covering the 2023 FIBA World Cup across Japan, Indonesia and the Philippines, brought to you by the Pick and Roll. Head to pickandroll.com.au. I'm Adam Webster and I'm joined live and exclusively from Okinawa, Jacob Dool and Tom Hirsch. Jacob, I'll start with you. You got in a little bit later than Tom. I've already spoken to Tom about the heat. Are you feeling the heat right now in Okinawa?
I am. I'm sitting here in front of the aircon, absolutely blasting and still struggling a little bit, being from Tassie, not used to anything above sort of 20 degrees. But no, it's a nice change and it's good fun to be here in Okinawa for the group stages.
Thanks for that. It was 4 degrees when I woke up this morning, so really appreciate the update, Jacob. Thank you. Tom.
Makes me feel better about how much I'm sweating.
Absolutely. Tom, any more 4 a.m. alarms from the Japanese authorities to you?
Thankfully not. No, the last 2 nights have been relatively peaceful, albeit later nights. But yeah, no, I think that's a rarity. And from what I've been told, and actually Brock Modem kindly reached out to me the next morning just to reassure me, because he's spent the last year in Japan playing over here, that it happens multiple times a year across Japan and not to be too alarmed. So Good to know.
That's comforting. Although not comforting at the time when you got the text through. Not ideal. So we'll move to the very first day of gameplay and we'll come to you after every Australia game. So every second day from here on in, we'll present an episode to you where we talk about the results from the World Cup. So we have to start in Group E and we have to start obviously with the Boomers. They overcame an 8-point deficit early on to beat Finland 98-72. Jacob, I'll start with you. You were in Okinawa for the game. You got to witness Australia kind of dig themselves out of an early hole and find their footing. What were your immediate takeaways from the win against Finland?
It was a good performance, I think, in the end. There were some concerns early on with sort of the continuation of a lot of the issues that we saw in the warm-up games, especially offensively, that the Boomers just couldn't get going. But once they sort of settled down, maybe got some nerves out of the way and started to get stops and run off them, things really clicked. And I think we sort of ended up seeing this Boomers team close to their best as the game sort of closed out down the stretch.
Paddy Mills finally found his shot, Tom. And, you know, Matty Logue gave us a scorching hot take on the last episode around his form. And he was right. I mean, Paddy was not in very good form and couldn't really find the bottom of the net. But it seemed to be that he worked himself out in the Finland game. He did take a lot of shots early on, but he was able to find his footing and score 25 points, get 8 rebounds. So he contributed extremely well and kept his FIBA World Cup average right up there.
Yeah, I mean, and that's what you would expect out of Paddy. It was a little ominous because the very first possession of the game, the ball slipped through his hands on a beautiful backdoor cut for a layup, and he kind of regathered and came out and dribbled round and managed to hit the first basket anyway, get himself rolling. He still struggled a little bit from long range, but the shots that he was making from the mid-range and the way he was just zipping around the court as he does, you know, FIBA Paddy is FIBA Paddy, and I think if anyone had any doubts around him, those have kind of been allayed from last night's performance. Interestingly, Joe Ingles said to us post-game in the media mix zone that, you know, they see the work that he puts in every day and they weren't ever really worried, even though there was a lot of noise from outside. So it was nice for him to get that monkey off his back. And I think it was also a good confidence booster for this Boomers team just to help settle them down, because there are a lot of young players on this team. And as Jacob said, there were obviously some clear nerves early on. And, you know, Josh Giddey's one guy that looked a bit shaky to start the game, missed a few little runners that he would normally make, things like that. But I think having Paddy there and getting going early was good just to keep them at bay, even though it took them a while to kind of find some flow and rhythm through this game.
It was really Paddy and Joe that sort of kept them in it early on until they found their feet. And one of the guys that, played extremely well to extend the league was Dante Exum. He was able to create. He, set up Xavier Cooks for a huge dunk across the game. And Jacob, it's great to see Dante sort of cementing himself as the backup point guard on this team and looking so confident on both ends as he played really good defense as well.
He was fantastic. And as you say, he really was sort of the key in pushing that lead out from a narrow lead at halftime to a really comfortable one. I think he had 8 points and 3 assists in the third quarter alone, and just really powered that surge there. And again, like he did with Paddy, Joe Ingles said post game that this is what we expect from Dante now. This is something that they think he can do really regularly, and he was a really strong contributor in Tokyo, but we've seen in the time since that he's taken his game to another level, shooting the ball, creating for others, and defensively he's still just as good and just as disruptive as he's always been. So he did kind of lead the second unit in this game, and it was a second unit that did really well and made a massive difference.
Larry Markkinen for the Finnish team ended up with 19 points on 17 shots along with 8 rebounds. Nick Kay played good defense on him early, but had 2 early fouls, so they had to sort of throw a few different looks at him. And I want to talk about Jack White. I'm not a big fan of individual game plus minus, but Jack White at plus 25 just feels very, very right, Tom, because of the effort that he showed and the way that he was able to slow down and limit Larry Markkinen as much as you can with an NBA All-Star player. He was fantastic and even was able to knock down some shots toward the end of the game.
Yeah, and you talk about the Boomers players all knowing their roles on this team. That was just a wonderful example of someone coming into the game with a specific role in mind. My job is there to harass and limit and slow down the best player on the other team, and I'll do whatever I can to do that. And Jack White did it fantastically, and especially in that first and second quarter when the team was struggling down the other end, just to make Lowry really work for every basket. And he did get his at times, but they were really hardly contested. And Jack did a fantastic job. Nick Kay also did a fantastic job, but also the collective help defense that knew when to come and double team. And there was a couple of possessions, and one in particular I remember where Duop Reith came out of nowhere out of the blind side, and Marker never saw him coming and harassed him with a huge double team that forced Larry to throw the ball out of bounds. And those little plays over the course of a game just break him down, wear him down a little bit to the point where someone else has to beat you. And once the others stop hitting shots, that's when the Boomers start to get control of that game.
I want to mention Josh Green. He only played 14 minutes and obviously has been bothered by an ankle complaint. Jacob, do you see his role being limited due to that injury, or is it more sort of caution, do you think, from the coaching staff and the medical staff?
It's a little bit hard to say, isn't it? Because they have been kind of coy on the injury. They've said that he's fully healthy. Brian Goorjian said the day before the game that they had no injuries coming into the game. So you'd think that it's not a concern, but it was a little bit of a surprise to not see him play more minutes in this game. But I have to say, when he did come into the game, that kind of was when things started to shift, when they put out Josh Green and Matisse Thybulle together and just focused on the defense and started to get that right. That's kind of when the Boomers started to get going. So I think we can certainly hope that Josh Green isn't limited at all by that injury that he had coming in, because he's already shown that he's a massive difference maker for this team.
Tom, looking forward to the Germany game, and we'll talk about Germany versus Japan shortly, but do you think that Jack White, Josh Green, Matisse Thybulle, we could see all three of them out there together at different points to defend the Wagners and Dennis Schroeder and kind of throw a few different players at those guys?
I think we'll definitely see some very different and varied combinations throughout that game. And that's one of the strengths of this team, is the versatility they have defensively. And it's going to depend as to who gets going. Last night, it was Mo Wagner that got going, and obviously Schroeder was pretty effective. Franz Wagner was a bit more limited, but that could easily flip on its head tomorrow night when we face them. The big thing is going to be keeping them off the offensive glass for me, right? And that takes a collective effort because we are undersized compared to Germany, and that's going to be the case tomorrow night again. You know, Reith and Nick Kay can only do so much. Xavier Cooks can only do so much. You need the Jack Whites and the Thibals and the Josh Greens and even the Josh Giddies to get in there and really control those defensive boards, so we do limit their offensive possessions, and then can push and transition the other way where we may have an advantage over them. So, yeah, to come back to your original question, I do think we're going to see a lot of varied lineups. And I love the ability for those sorts of guys that you mentioned to play different roles, throw different looks. You know, a slightly smaller player harassing a slightly taller player like Jack did to Lowry last night. And it can be really effective at times if they're playing a collective game on the defensive side of the floor.
Yeah, you have players that have the ability to do an individual role on a particular all-star or close to all-star player on the other team. So Germany versus Japan was the other game in Group E. Germany ended up winning that by 18 points despite probably one of the most spirited crowds I think I've seen in any basketball game. It reminded me of, you know, the very loudest crowds that I've ever witnessed. And Tom, you tweeted about it. The Okinawa crowd were just unbelievable for this Japanese team. Whenever anything happened, a steal, a rebound, you know, obviously points as well, they were on their feet and they were as loud as you could possibly be.
It actually reminds me, and this is in no way directed just at you guys, but it does remind me of the Jack Jumpers. The first year I was down there during the playoff run against Melbourne United, and they hung on every single possession from the opening tip. And that's what it was like last night, only in a much bigger arena. And it was a sea of red. And it was just a wonderful experience to be a part of, to be honest, a great atmosphere. But let's be honest, right? Japan's going to struggle in this group. I can't see them winning a game. It's possible they could make a game out of Finland if they get hot, but they're just undersized, and that's where they were beat last night, time and time again. Mo Wagner, Franz Wagner, Daniel Tice, these sorts of big guys, Voigtman, all had their way with the smaller Japanese players, and guys like Yuta Watanabe can only do so much defensively. So try as they may, and you know they got hot a little bit here and there, but they just don't have the talent, especially without Rui Hachimura on this team. But boy, did their crowd give them a lift as much as they possibly could.
Jacob, it's really interesting as NBA fans seeing guys that come off the bench in the NBA do really well at FIBA level, and you sort of see that talent on display. Daniel Tice is certainly one of those guys, along with Mo Wagner. But Germany were pretty deep yesterday and pretty clinical in the way that they were able to go about it against Japan, who were just jacking it up and trying as best as they possibly could to shoot themselves into the game.
Yeah, and that's what Japan have to do, isn't it? That's what they've done all through qualifying in the Asia Cup. They've gotten up a lot of threes to make up for, as you say, Tom, that lack of size and that lack of inside presence. But yeah, full credit to Germany. They took care of business really comfortably, really impressive as they have been in warm-up play. And I know Matt Logue was saying after that game that it's a bit of a scary matchup for Australia. This is a big test to face in the group stage, and I think this is a German team that would be expecting to go in and really compete with Australia and make that a game. Now, a lot's going to lie on the possible ankle injury to Franz Wagner, having scans today, I believe. So not sure if there's any results from those yet. But if he is out there on the court, then this is a really big, tough German team that's going to give Australia a lot of issues given their lack of size.
Tom, from what you saw from Germany yesterday, are you concerned about tomorrow night's game against the Boomers? Are you concerned about the ability for the Boomers to get over this Germany team?
No, concern's not the right word, Adam. I think it's going to be a challenge, but we knew that when they come up against these bigger teams, these bigger European teams, and the fact that we are a little undersized compared to what we hoped to be if we had Jock Landau in the lineup. Now, having said that, we proved against France and we proved against Georgia that if we play our style of game, we can compete with anyone, but we have to control the tempo. And as I said earlier, we have to keep them off the offensive glass. And that's, to me, one of the keys in terms of how you're going to beat these big teams and limit them, and then try and push in position in transition, where we potentially have a bit of a speed advantage. So I think we have enough really capable defenders that we can do that. And, there's no one out there that I'm like a Lowry or a Luca that you're really worried can score on any single possession. Like, Schroeder can get hot, yeah, and if France plays, he can create some stuff. I think Mo Wagner we can contain. I think Tice we can contain. Voigtman we can contain. It's just playing our game and controlling the tempo that I think is the key to winning tomorrow night.
That game will be on ESPN on Sunday evening, so we look forward to Australia versus Germany and also Japan versus Finland after that one. Across the rest of the World Cup, Group A had a couple of games yesterday. Italy got over Angola, and then in a really, really close and hard-fought matchup, the Dominican Republic beat the Philippines. It was, Jordan Clarkson versus Karl Anthony Towns, and it probably shouldn't surprise us that Karl Anthony Towns was able to get the nod and lead his Dominican Republic team. Not that he was the only contributor, but lead his Dominican Republic team to victory. But Jordan Clarkson gave it everything he had, and that Philippines crowd was, I would say, every bit as loud, if not louder, than the Okinawa crowd. Jacob, the Philippines, you're going there for the finals. They know their basketball, and they're very, very passionate.
They do, and they've already showed out in force a FIBA World Cup record crowd, I believe, at that game, somewhere in the mid 30,000s. So
crazy,
and all extremely loud fans, every single one of them, I'm sure. So it is a tough environment to go into, and I think that's what the Dominican Republic would have found out. With a player like Jordan Clarkson on the Philippines team, he's someone that can make shots in bunches and just lift the energy in the building. So I think that is a good effort from the Philippines to play the Dominican Republic and Karl Anthony Towns so close. But a big man like him, it's just such a tough matchup for a country that doesn't have that sort of polish in their front court. Towns struggled from the field, but when you get to the line 16 times, things become a lot easier, and that's because there's no other way to stop him sometimes than to foul him around the basket.
And the reason that the Dominicans were able to get that 6-point buffer in the end was Jordan Clarkson fouled out with about 5 minutes to go. So he was not on the floor down the stretch. He had 28 points, 7 rebounds, and 7 assists. He also had 8 turnovers. So that tells you that everything the Philippines were doing were going through their former six man of the year. So, a disappointing night for the host country, but an opportunity to, have a better result against Angola on Sunday evening. We also had action in Group D. So we had Montenegro defeat Mexico, and we had Lithuania beat Egypt. In that group, I imagine Montenegro is going to pretty much coast to the game with Lithuania in the 1-2, and that's going to decide who gets the first seed. Who do you like in that game, Tom? Lithuania or Montenegro?
Well, I haven't seen much from Montenegro, and obviously they're powered by Nikola Vucevic.
Yes.
Traditionally, I think Lithuania is just a deeper roster than Montenegro would be. And that could probably play a factor in that, because if they can limit Vuce, then who else is going to beat them? So I'd probably have to give an advantage to Lithuania just purely based on what they've done historically over the course of major FIBA tournaments.
And then lastly, Group H, we had Latvia really put a beating on Lebanon and shoot it well from outside. And then the main event last night was Canada versus France. That game didn't go how a lot of us were predicting. Certainly, it's not out of the realms of possibility to predict Canada would defeat France, but by 30 points, that's a ridiculous margin. Having watched that game, I can tell you that Shai Gilgeous-Alexander was 0 for 5 early in that game and looked very similar to Josh Giddey in the Australia game, a little tentative, a little nervous. And then Canada found themselves over the foul limit toward the end of the first quarter. Someone fouled Shai Gilgeous-Alexander at about half court and put him in the line. He sunk both free throws and then was just off to the races from there, and he was unstoppable. Finished with 27 points, 13 rebounds, 6 assists. The other call out was Kelly Olynyk with 18 points. He battled the whole time and really antagonized the French front line, which is what Kelly Olynyk tends to do best. And probably the other point is just the defense from Canada in the second half was unbelievable. I mean, it was 25-8 in the third quarter alone. So they were able to throw Dylan Brooks, Nicole Alexander-Walker, Lou Dort at the likes of Evan Fournier and Nando De Colo. And Nando De Colo and Evan Fournier paced France in the first half. They were brilliant. And they were pretty much the only reason that France were in the game to the half. They weren't really getting any contributions from anyone else. And Jacob, it was crazy to see Canada's defensive intensity raise in the second half, and then a 30-point margin. Once again, I can't overstate how impressive it is for Canada to have their first victory over any European side in a World Cup and have that come up against the team that won bronze in the previous World Cup.
And it's just so impressive that they were able to have a comfortable win like that after trailing early. You know, the concern with this Canadian team was that they're not experienced playing together. They're not experienced in FIBA competition, and that it might take a while to settle. Well, trailing at quarter time against a team like France that does have that experience is, I think, exactly the kind of scenario that would put a team like that under the pump and really turn the screws on them. But the fact that they were able to rally and come back and throw an absolute sucker punch at one of the tournament favorites and really knock them to the canvas, it's a warning to the rest of the competition. Not that I think one was needed given the level of talent on this Canadian team, but the fact that they're gelling together so well so early in this competition, I think, is a really ominous sign, and they're a team that could go a long way.
Tom, Latvia put 109 points on Lebanon in the other Group H game, and they scored 18 of 35 from the three-point line. Point differential matters in the World Cup, and your record not only carries through in the group stage, but carries through to the next stage as well. Latvia have, a plus 39 point differential. France have a minus 30 point differential. So when those two teams play against each other, if Canada happens to drop their game against Latvia, if Latvia shoot the lights out, then suddenly France is under pressure to really run up the score in their other two games to try and make the second round. And, Canada, as we've said, they were really impressive against France. There's nothing to say that they could have an off night at some point. Latvia could shoot the lights out against either one of those two teams. It's unlikely, but it could happen, and it makes the rest of the games in this group all the more interesting.
It really does, and that starts tomorrow night because France meets Latvia. And not only is it a must-win game for France, but they need to win big to reduce that points differential, exactly as you said, because if they can beat Latvia by 30, 35 points, then all of a sudden they erase Latvia's advantage, and they obviously help themselves in terms of decreasing what was done against them last night by Canada. But it's a huge game either way, and it's not beyond the realms of possibility that if Latvia gets hot again, they could sneak one against France and put them out of the tournament, which would be unheard of or unthinkable. I don't believe that's how it's going to play out. I think France will make adjustments. I think they'll come out with a really strong intent to right last night's wrong. But certainly makes for a very intriguing group. And it just makes me, in many ways, wish that Kristaps Porzingis was actually here on this Latvian team, because this is hands down one of the most interesting groups across the tournament, aside from potentially our own one in Group E.
Absolutely. And as we look forward to Sunday, those particular matchups, Australia versus Germany and France versus Latvia, stick out among all others. Italy versus the Dominican Republic is probably the other one that will be really interesting in Group A. And, I think, Jacob, that will decide top spot in Group A at this point, given the results from day one and given who they have left to play.
Yeah, I think you're right. That one looks fairly cut and dried, that those two teams will be the ones that advance and move on. But you just never quite know in a tournament like this, do you? We've seen big upsets before, and it's not out of the realm of possibility that we see a mix-up. But no, I think you're right. There's just too much talent there to overcome, really.
So looking forward to match day number 2. You guys have a couple of games in Okinawa. You've got Cape Verde versus Georgia and Slovenia versus Venezuela. You going to be able to get to either of those ones?
We're going to try. I'm interested to watch Slovenia play, obviously, because they're our main threat when we get to Group 2. Unfortunately, the timing of it clashes with the USA versus New Zealand game, so I'm going to have to make a choice later on as to which one we prioritise. But certainly some interesting games on the slate for today.
And another one to point out is probably Spain having their first game against Cote d'Ivoire. We get our first look at Spain in Group G Jacob, they'll be out for blood as usual. They're in a tough group with Brazil. So, given Brazil beating Australia in the warm-up games, you would think that it's out of those two teams to make the second round. We'll see if Spain can stamp their authority on Group G this evening in Indonesia.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see Spain in action for the first time, and a little bit of a changing of the guard over recent years for them. They've lost a few of those veterans and those bigger name players that they've had in the past and have powered them to some really good results at these major tournaments. But there's still a ton of talent on this team. You've got the Hernan Gomez brothers, you've got former NBA players like Alex Abrinas, Victor Claver, Sergio Llull, who's been really good in Europe. So this is a team that I think still can compete with the best at this tournament. And if they can come out firing against the Ivory Coast and start off strong with a big win, I think they could really get rolling here.
Well, that about does it for our coverage of game day 1 of the 2023 FIBA Basketball World Cup. We will come to you again after the Australia-Germany game on Sunday evening. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you again next time.